It was the summer of 1944, deep in the heart of France, months after the Allied forces had stormed the beaches of Normandy. The air was heavy with the scent of dust, gunpowder, and the faint trace of smoke from distant skirmishes. In a sprawling field just beyond the front lines, a group of German prisoners of war shuffled nervously toward a long canvas mess tent, their boots sinking slightly into the uneven, trodden earth. The uniformed men, worn gaunt, their faces etched with months of hunger and fear, exchanged glances, a mix of suspicion and desperate curiosity. Whispers broke the tense silence, rumors of a meal unlike any they had seen since the war began. The Americans, disciplined and orderly, moved with a precision that almost seemed ceremonial, laying out steaming trays of meat, vegetables, bread, and fresh fruit. The prisoners froze, eyes widening, as the rich aromas enveloped them, a sensory world far removed from the thin gruel and stale bread they had grown accustomed to. Some could not comprehend the sheer abundance, others glanced at each other in disbelief, half expecting the offer to vanish as a cruel joke. For a fleeting moment the war, the endless march of orders, the fear of shellfire, the constant hunger, was suspended. Here, in the middle of a temporary American encampment, the men faced a reality so generous it almost felt unreal, a feast that, in their own minds, might have been reserved for generals. Laughter trembled at the corners of their mouths, hesitant smiles flickered, and eyes glistened with a mix of gratitude and shock, emotions that no battlefield victory could ever evoke. As they stepped closer to the mess tent, the German prisoners of war were met with a scene that defied every expectation they had carried with them since the day of their capture. The rows of tables stretched endlessly, each one laid out with a precision that seemed almost ritualistic, the kind of meticulous order they had only ever seen in high command quarters or the officers' mess. Metal trays gleamed under the soft daylight filtering through the canvas, reflecting the steam that rose from bowls brimming with thick, rich stews, tender cuts of meat glistening with freshly rendered fat, and vegetables that smelled so fresh it was almost overwhelming. The aroma, an intoxicating mix of roasted meat, buttery potatoes, and earthy greens, filled their senses, forcing them to pause mid-step, as though the very air around them was demanding attention, respect, and disbelief. Every detail was arranged with a care they had not thought possible in wartime conditions. Bread loaves, still warm and crusty, were placed at intervals along the tables, and small bowls of fruit, simple but vibrant, added unexpected color to the otherwise utilitarian metal and canvas environment. The clatter of utensils against trays, the low hum of conversation in English, and the occasional laughter of American cooks moving briskly between the tables created a rhythm that was both alien and strangely comforting, a soundtrack of life continuing in the midst of war. The prisoners' faces, gaunt and hollow from weeks of insufficient rations, betrayed a mixture of incredulity and cautious hope. Some lowered their heads, uncertain if they were dreaming, while others dared a hesitant step forward, their hands shaking, eyes fixed on the plates, as though mere touch could prove this scene real. The uniformity of the presentation, the symmetrical arrangement of food, the careful placement of trays, the neat lines of soldiers serving without impatience or malice, ignited a deep, almost childlike awe, a realization that somewhere, beyond the front lines and the bullets and the fear, the world could still provide generosity without expectation or calculation. For many, this was the first time since being captured that they had encountered an act of service that treated them as humans rather than enemies, and that awareness rippled through the group like a quiet, potent wave, softening the rigid posture that years of discipline and fear had instilled in them. Some men, unable to contain a flicker of emotion, exchanged glances that carried the weight of unspoken relief, a mutual acknowledgement that this moment was a brief, miraculous reprieve from the relentless hardship they had endured. They noticed the small, almost imperceptible gestures of the American cooks, a careful ladle poured into the waiting tray, a slight smile exchanged with a hesitant hand, a nod of reassurance that invited them to partake without judgment or hesitation. Each act, though simple in execution, resonated profoundly against the backdrop of deprivation, reminding them that nourishment and compassion could exist even amid global conflict. The men shuffled forward slowly, the gravel crunching beneath their boots, marking the passage from suspicion to tentative acceptance. Each step carried with it a silent calculation: would the generosity last? Was this a ruse? Could something so lavish and thoughtfully prepared truly be offered freely to those they had considered enemies mere moments ago? And yet, with each tray lifted, with each bowl filled, the tension that had gripped them since capture began to dissolve, replaced by a tentative, growing trust. The air in the tent, heavy with the scent of food, also seemed saturated with a quiet tension that gradually gave way to murmurs, soft exclamations, and the almost imperceptible cracking of smiles. Men reached for the first portions with hands that trembled from both hunger and disbelief, lifting spoonfuls of rich stew that seemed too good to be true, feeling the warmth of the food seep into fingers and palms in a way that contrasted starkly with the cold, hard months of starvation they had endured. They looked at one another with a mixture of astonishment and relief, a silent questioning that lingered in the eyes. Was this really happening? Could war allow for such a human moment, such an uncalculated kindness? In some corners of the tent, prisoners tentatively guided others, whispering reassurances in German, gestures of camaraderie mingling with the bewildering generosity before them. The soundscape of the mess hall, the clatter of trays, the quiet murmuring, the subtle hiss of steam rising from each carefully prepared dish, became almost hypnotic, a lullaby of normalcy and civilization that had been absent for far too long. Some men paused to observe the American soldiers themselves, the efficiency of their movements, the attentiveness in their eyes, the patient manner in which they ensured no prisoner went without. These were men who, only hours earlier, had been adversaries in a global conflict, yet here they were, acting not out of obligation or propaganda, but simple human decency. For the German prisoners, many of whom had been conditioned to expect cruelty and scarcity, the dissonance was profound, almost overwhelming. Every element of the scene, the shining metal trays, the warmth emanating from each dish, the rhythmic movement of the cooks, the steady gaze of the servers, combined to create a tableau of care so vivid that some could not help but tremble. Some men even instinctively reached for their companions' hands or shoulders, a silent gesture of solidarity as they navigated a world that suddenly felt less hostile, more alive, and infinitely more humane. The experience was tactile as well as visual: the heat of the metal tray, the weight of the spoon, the steam rising into their faces and fogging their glasses, the contrast of soft bread against fingers long accustomed to rough rations. All of these sensations layered together, creating a deeply immersive moment that seemed to stretch time, suspending the prisoners in a fragile bubble of disbelief, awe, and gratitude. There was laughter too, timid at first, breaking through the pervasive tension, growing as more men realized that they were allowed, even encouraged, to enjoy this meal without fear. The sound, delicate and unexpected, reverberated through the tent, a chorus of relief that mingled with the clinking of utensils and the soft shuffle of boots on the tent floor. This laughter was punctuated by silent expressions of gratitude, by eyes glistening at the thought that, for a brief interlude, war had not erased humanity. The initial hesitation, the wary glances, the hesitant steps forward, the careful measurements of distance and gesture, gradually gave way to participation. They took plates, lifted bowls, and sat where they were guided, finally allowing themselves to eat, to taste, to acknowledge nourishment that had long been absent. The visual contrast of the gaunt, hollowed faces against the vibrant, steaming food created a cinematic tension that was almost surreal, a living photograph of shock, disbelief, and the slow thawing of mistrust. In that moment, each man became acutely aware of the layers of meaning in this unexpected feast, the skill of the cooks, the intention behind each carefully placed dish, the patience and empathy of the soldiers offering without expectation, the undeniable humanity present in the smallest details. It was a lesson in dignity, an unspoken message that even in the darkest chapters of conflict, compassion could assert itself, quietly, insistently, and irrevocably. The prisoners' reactions varied. Some stared in open-mouthed astonishment, others dabbed at their eyes. A few whispered thanks they were not sure anyone would understand. And yet, every reaction contributed to the growing tableau of human connection, a visual and emotional mosaic of shock, humility, and relief. As the first plates were lifted and the initial tremors of disbelief began to settle into hesitant enjoyment, the tent itself seemed transformed. No longer a space of intimidation or surveillance, but a sanctuary of sorts where sustenance and humanity coexisted in a delicate, fleeting harmony. The meticulous arrangements, the abundance of food, and the patient care of the Americans had done more than feed bodies. They had nourished spirits, restoring a fragile sense of hope that the men had thought lost amidst months of captivity. It was a moment both ordinary and extraordinary, simple in execution, yet monumental in impact, a scene etched into the memories of all who witnessed it, forever tied to the complex, often brutal realities of war, and yet shining as an emblem of the unexpected grace that humanity can offer even in its darkest hours. The men's initial tension had dissolved entirely now, replaced by quiet murmurs, the soft scrape of chairs against the tent floor, and the tentative, yet unmistakable emergence of camaraderie among prisoners who had been brought together by circumstance, but were now united in shared astonishment at the generosity laid before them. Hands reached for food with newfound confidence, spoons dipped into bowls without hesitation, and for a brief but unforgettable moment, the endless anxiety and deprivation of the previous months fell away, leaving in its place something almost magical, a collective recognition that, even amidst global conflict, care and decency could exist, tangible, palpable, and deeply affecting. The atmosphere dense with aroma, light, and the quiet music of human interaction was a living, breathing testament to the power of simple acts, a sensory and emotional experience that would resonate far beyond the walls of that temporary tent, embedding itself in memory and history alike. The scene lingered in every glance, every careful movement, every quiet acknowledgement exchanged among the men. A living testament to a truth too often forgotten in war, that humanity can endure, that compassion can shine through, and that even in the bleakest circumstances, the simple act of sharing a meal can become a profound, transformative experience. Around the tables, the German prisoners began to notice details that went far beyond the sheer abundance of food. Their eyes, initially wide with disbelief, now shifted to the subtle qualities that made the meal almost surreal. The bread, still warm from the oven, cradled in hands that had known only stale rations, was soft yet firm, its crust crisp and golden, a tactile marvel to men who had long ago forgotten the texture of freshly baked loaves. The vegetables, vivid in color and carefully cooked, carried an aroma that reminded them of home gardens they could barely recall. Carrots glistened with a sheen of butter, peas popped in gentle bursts of flavor, and potatoes were tender, seasoned lightly, the earthy aroma mingling with the richer scent of roasted meat. Even the simplest details, the polished surfaces of the metal trays, the small bowls of fruit set at intervals, spoke of thoughtfulness, of planning, of a generosity they had not dared to imagine in wartime captivity. The prisoners' eyes darted from tray to tray, noting the symmetry, the care, the unmistakable attention to presentation. It was as if the meal itself was a message: here, in this moment, you are seen, you are acknowledged. You are worthy of care. Hesitant hands reached toward the first offerings, fingers brushing the edge of a tray, lingering over the steaming contents as though touch alone could confirm reality. Some men inhaled sharply, closing their eyes briefly, trying to imprint the smell, the warmth, the vibrant colors onto memory. Others shifted in their seats, still uncertain, wary of a trap, the weight of years of war and deprivation pressing against instinct, caution whispering in every nerve, take only what you need, expect nothing more. And yet, the warmth of the American soldiers' presence, their calm efficiency, their soft smiles and encouraging nods, steadily eroded that instinctive suspicion. One soldier, noticing a man hovering at the edge of the line, silently gestured him forward, ladled a generous portion into his tray, and stepped back without a word, the simplicity of the gesture striking with profound impact. Small acts like these resonated far more than words could. No explanation was required, no justification offered, only the quiet affirmation that the prisoner's basic humanity mattered. Slowly, the men settled into the rhythm of the meal, the initial shock giving way to cautious participation. Plates and trays were lifted, hands trembling slightly, fingers brushing against the warm surfaces as they moved food toward themselves. The soundscape of the mess hall shifted. The low hum of conversation mingled with soft chuckles, the scrape of chairs against the wooden floor punctuated by gentle laughter, tentative at first and growing as familiarity and comfort replaced disbelief. Some men exchanged quiet whispers in German, tentative comments about the quality of the food, observations of detail, and unspoken expressions of relief. It was a language of astonishment and gratitude, carried not by formal words but by tone, gesture, and the subtle light in their eyes. As they began to eat, the prisoners became increasingly attuned to the nuances of the meal. Each bite was a revelation, a sensory contrast to the meager rations that had defined months of captivity. The richness of the stew, the tenderness of the meat, the subtle seasoning on the vegetables, all spoke to effort, care, and a conscious intention to provide more than mere sustenance. For the first time in a long while, the men could eat without anxiety, without the pressing fear that their next meal would be uncertain. They could taste, fully and deliberately, the flavors and textures, and each mouthful carried a psychological weight, a reminder that, even in the midst of war, civility and decency could manifest in tangible, nourishing forms. Around the room, the interplay between the prisoners and the soldiers grew increasingly human, almost familial in its subtlety. A man who had been hesitant moments before now lifted his tray proudly, nodding to the cook who had served him, a silent exchange acknowledging both gratitude and the dignity afforded by the gesture. Another quietly assisted a companion who struggled to balance a heavy plate, guiding it gently onto the table with care. These interactions, small and unremarkable in isolation, collectively transformed the atmosphere, creating a living tapestry of mutual recognition, fleeting yet deeply resonant. Observing the American soldiers, the prisoners could not help but notice the patience and attentiveness in every movement. There was no rush, no visible irritation, no hint that they were bound by duty rather than choice. Each serving was deliberate, thoughtful, and imbued with an implicit understanding that those receiving the food were not simply captives. They were human beings whose well-being mattered, even if only in this single, fleeting instance. The gestures, no matter how small, were monumental in impact. A ladle lifted at the precise angle to avoid spillage, a gentle word offered with no expectation of reciprocation, the careful arrangement of food to ensure every man received an equal portion. All these elements combined to create an environment that transcended the utilitarian purpose of a military mess hall, elevating it into something almost sacred in its simplicity. As more prisoners took their seats and began eating, the communal nature of the experience became increasingly evident. Men who had previously avoided eye contact now shared glances filled with wonder and tentative joy. Conversations, initially fragmented and cautious, began to coalesce into a rhythm, punctuated by exclamations of surprise, murmurs of delight, and whispered notes of appreciation. The human connection, fragile yet undeniable, expanded outward from each tray, linking the individuals into a shared experience that transcended uniform, nationality, and conflict. It was a moment of normalization in the midst of chaos, a temporary reclamation of dignity that had been eroded by months of hardship. Even the physical sensations of the meal contributed to the prisoners' astonishment. The warmth radiating from the trays, the softness of the bread, the juiciness of the meat, and the subtle snap of vegetables combined to create a tactile experience that contrasted sharply with the cold metal, rough bread, and watery soups they had endured in previous months. Each sensory input reinforced the message that this was no ordinary meal, no perfunctory sustenance, but an act of deliberate generosity designed to restore not just strength, but humanity. Some men paused mid-bite, closing their eyes briefly to savor the textures, to imprint the moment, to allow themselves to fully register the care that had gone into the meal. Others glanced around the tent, taking in the collective astonishment of their fellow prisoners, the gentle smiles of the American soldiers, the symmetry and precision of the food, the comforting rhythm of sounds that signaled order, calm, and attentiveness. It was almost impossible to separate the act of eating from the awareness of the environment itself, each sensory impression layered upon the others, producing a rich, multi-dimensional experience that was both deeply personal and shared communally. As the meal progressed, the prisoners' initial hesitation transformed into quiet engagement, the fear and suspicion that had held them back slowly melting away. Conversations grew slightly louder, laughter became more confident, and gestures of cooperation began to appear spontaneously. Sharing utensils, passing dishes, and guiding those less steady in their movements. Each act, though simple, was significant a demonstration that trust, once tentatively established, could flourish even in a temporary, constrained environment. The atmosphere within the tent evolved, taking on a rhythm all its own. The clinking of utensils, the soft murmur of German and English mixed together, the occasional chuckle or sigh of contentment, and the steady, deliberate movements of the American cooks created a living symphony of human connection. Time seemed to stretch, elongating each moment into a slow-motion tableau in which every glance, every gesture, every sensation was magnified and internalized. By the end of the meal, the prisoners had fully absorbed the lesson inherent in this unexpected generosity, that human kindness could exist even amidst profound adversity, that thoughtful actions could restore dignity, that shared nourishment could create bonds that transcended enmity, if only temporarily. They would remember not just the taste of the food, but the care that had brought it to them, the patience of those who served, and the subtle, yet undeniable assertion of humanity in an environment otherwise defined by conflict. The soft smiles exchanged, the relaxed yet cautious posture of each man, the quiet nods and whispered observations, and the collective astonishment etched across the faces of the prisoners would linger long after the plates were emptied. This meal, ordinary in preparation, but extraordinary in execution, had transformed the space into something far more than a mess hall. It had become a sanctuary, a brief oasis of compassion and humanity that resonated deeply in the hearts of men who had long been deprived of both. The impact was tangible, a palpable shift in atmosphere, energy, and emotion. Through the meticulous care in preparation, the attention to individual needs, and the unspoken communication of respect and decency, the American soldiers had created an environment that allowed the prisoners to reclaim a small measure of self-worth, even if only for an hour or two. And as they sat, savoring each bite, allowing themselves to feel gratitude without fear, the prisoners could not help but reflect on the absurdity and profundity of the moment. In the midst of war, nourishment and kindness could intersect so perfectly, producing a fleeting yet unforgettable testament to shared humanity, a lesson as enduring as it was unexpected. By the end of the meal, the prisoners' initial shock had transformed into a quiet, reflective awe, a profound recognition that what they had just experienced was far more than a simple act of feeding the hungry. Plates, once brimming with rich, steaming food, were now empty, the last morsels consumed with reverence, not haste, a testament to the understanding that this generosity had not been bound by obligation but by conscious, human choice. There was no clamor, no frantic scraping of trays, no sense of competition for portions. The tent, though filled with dozens of men, radiated an unusual calm, a harmony that seemed to hum softly beneath the ambient sounds of cutlery and muted conversation. Men leaned back slightly in their chairs, elbows resting on tables, and for the first time in many months allowed themselves to linger, to reflect, to breathe, to inhabit a moment without the omnipresent tension of war pressing against every nerve. The food had been sustenance, yes, but it had also been a conduit for something larger, something immeasurable, the restoration of dignity, the quiet assertion of humanity, the unexpected revelation that care could exist even across the divide of combatant and captive. As they looked around, their eyes met those of their fellow prisoners, and the shared astonishment, gratitude, and tentative joy created an unspoken bond, a communal recognition of what had transpired. These were not soldiers merely fed, these were men who had been reminded, in a tangible, sensory way, that the world still contained decency, attentiveness, and above all, empathy. In the muted glow of daylight filtering through the canvas tent, faces that had been gaunt and weary now held subtle expressions of wonder mixed with a hesitant, fragile hope that seemed almost audacious in the context of their circumstances. Some men whispered to one another in low tones, tentative words of astonishment, disbelief, and sometimes gratitude, their voices carrying a cadence that suggested they were trying to ground themselves in reality, to convince their minds that what they had just experienced was not an illusion born of exhaustion or desperation. Others remained silent, simply observing, allowing their senses to absorb the lingering warmth of the food, the precise arrangement of the trays, the unhurried, patient demeanor of the soldiers who had served them, and the subtle, yet undeniable, aura of kindness that suffused the space. This quiet reflection was punctuated by small, human gestures, a prisoner nudging a companion to take the last slice of bread, another gently passing a piece of fruit across the table, a soft nod of acknowledgement to a soldier who had offered a second helping without comment. Each act, though seemingly minor, carried immense emotional weight, reinforcing the realization that this moment was not only about physical nourishment, but also about mutual recognition, respect, and the fragile reclamation of trust in a world fractured by conflict. The interplay of light, sound, and smell contributed to the depth of the experience. Sunlight filtering through the tent flaps cast gentle, warm shadows across the faces of the men, illuminating expressions of astonishment, relief, and slowly growing contentment. The subtle scent of leftover steam, the earthy aroma of potatoes and meat, the faint tang of fresh bread, and the lingering sweetness of fruit created a sensory memory that would embed itself in their minds long after they left the tent. The clatter of utensils and soft murmur of conversation blended with the natural rhythm of human digestion, forming a soundscape that felt intimate, almost sacred in its ordinariness. The prisoners, many of whom had endured months of deprivation and uncertainty, found themselves participating in an act of shared humanity that transcended language, nationality, and the arbitrary divisions of war. Each glance exchanged across the table, each tentative smile, each quiet acknowledgement of another's presence contributed to a mosaic of connection, subtle yet profound, that transformed the temporary canvas shelter into a space of quiet sanctuary. Their reflections extended beyond the immediate moment to the broader context of their experiences in captivity. Thoughts of past hardships, hunger, and fear mingled with the simple joy of a meal prepared with care, creating a layered, almost cinematic awareness of contrast, scarcity versus abundance, neglect versus attentiveness, suspicion versus kindness. This juxtaposition heightened the emotional resonance of the experience, deepening the prisoners' understanding that what they were witnessing was extraordinary not merely because of the food itself, but because of the intent, precision, and humanity behind it. Men began to notice the subtleties of the soldiers' behavior more keenly, the gentle, steady movements, the deliberate pacing that ensured no one felt rushed, the occasional glance or nod that acknowledged hesitation or uncertainty without judgment, the quiet attentiveness that allowed each prisoner to approach the meal at their own pace. The soldier's presence, calm yet purposeful, reinforced the prisoners' perception that they were not simply being fed as an obligation, but respected as human beings whose needs, comfort, and dignity mattered. In observing these nuances, The prisoners began to internalize the broader message embedded within the act of sharing a meal, that human decency could manifest even in wartime. That empathy was not extinguished by the divisions of ideology or allegiance, and that moments of connection could emerge even amidst conflict. The atmosphere within the tent, initially charged with tension and disbelief, had transformed into one of quiet reflection and mutual acknowledgement. The collective experience of the meal created a sense of temporal suspension, in which the relentless pressures of war, the constant uncertainty, and the pervasive hunger seemed to recede, allowing space for presence, attention, and recognition. In these fleeting moments, the prisoners were not enemies, nor were they captives. They were simply human beings, absorbing kindness and care in its purest form, and responding with the natural, unforced expressions of gratitude, relief, and awe that had been dormant for far too long. Small interactions continued to reinforce the emotional significance of the experience. A man who had initially sat silently now reached across to share a portion with a neighbor, who responded with a nod of acknowledgement and an almost imperceptible smile. Others quietly commented on the quality of the food, on its warmth, its preparation, or its freshness, each remark serving as both observation and expression of appreciation. These verbal exchanges, though muted, carried tremendous weight, signaling recognition, trust, and the slow rebuilding of psychological stability eroded by captivity. The prisoners also became acutely aware of the social dimension of the meal. For the first time in many months, they could observe and participate in a communal experience without fear, judgment, or competition. The shared participation in eating, the subtle coordination of gestures, the silent acknowledgement of one another's presence and needs, all contributed to the creation of a temporary microcosm of society in which basic human dignity and respect were honored. The quiet awe that pervaded the tent was punctuated by brief flashes of humor, tentative laughter, and subtle expressions of joy, each instance reinforcing the contrast between the relentless pressures of wartime and the simple, yet profound, impact of attentive care. This layering of experiences, sensory, emotional, social, created a complex, multi-dimensional understanding among the prisoners. They realized that the meal was not merely about nourishment, but about recognition, about the assertion of shared humanity, about the possibility of experiencing care even in an environment structured by control, power, and conflict. Each bite, each glance, each small gesture of interaction carried significance far beyond its immediate physical manifestation. As the meal drew to a close, the prisoners found themselves in a state of quiet, contemplative reflection. The tent, filled moments earlier with tentative steps and hesitant glances, now radiated a calm sense of completion and subdued contentment. Men leaned back, heads slightly bowed, eyes glistening, hands resting lightly on the table or trays, absorbing the emotional resonance of what they had just experienced. They were not merely reflecting on the meal itself, but on the broader implications, the capacity for kindness to exist even amidst cruelty, the possibility of recognition and dignity even in captivity, and the profound human need for acknowledgement, connection, and care. Some men exchanged brief, whispered words of thanks, not expecting responses, simply needing to voice the depth of emotion stirred by the act. Others remained silent, allowing their sensations, memories, and internal reflections to process the extraordinary nature of the experience. The light, now softer as the day progressed, filtered through the tent flaps, casting long, gentle shadows that accentuated the contours of weary yet awakened faces. The combination of sunlight, steam, and the metallic sheen of the trays created a visual tableau of serenity, reflection, and subtle wonder. The prisoners' eyes frequently wandered to the American soldiers, noting the unwavering patience, the quiet attentiveness, and the understated warmth in every gesture. It was clear that these men were committed not only to performing their duty, but to providing care in a way that respected individuality and dignity. This realization deepened the prisoners' emotional engagement, reinforcing the perception that the meal had been both a physical and psychological gift, carefully orchestrated to restore something lost over months of deprivation and uncertainty. By the time the prisoners rose from the tables, their movements were unhurried, deliberate, and reflective. They adjusted clothing, brushed crumbs from trays, and nodded to one another, acknowledging a shared experience that had temporarily, yet profoundly, transformed their perception of captivity, humanity, and the world beyond their immediate circumstances. The act of eating, once purely functional, had become a medium through which trust, recognition, and quiet dignity were communicated, experienced, and internalized. The residual warmth of the food, the lingering aromas, the gentle light, the subtle murmur of conversation, and the awareness of attentive, compassionate presence all coalesced into a layered, lasting memory that would remain indelibly imprinted upon every man who had participated. In these moments, captured within the confined, temporary space of a canvas tent, the prisoners had experienced something extraordinary, a reclamation of humanity, a fragile but undeniable affirmation that even amidst war, empathy, patience, and generosity could prevail, creating an indelible emotional resonance that would echo far beyond the meal itself.